The cowboy looked at the shivering bride beside the train platform and asked one question that made the whole town go silent. Snow slapped against the depot windows as the man crumpled the marriage papers in his fist and walked away from her without looking back. The bride's suitcase tipped sideways into the slush. Then a rough-handed cowboy stepped out of the wind, glanced at the untouched supper basket beside her boots, and quietly asked, "Can you cook?" She answered once, and something in his face changed before anyone understood why. "Tell me where you're listening from as the story begins." Winter came early to Red Flint that year. Snow clung to the wooden roofs along Main Street while wind rolled down from the Bitterroot Mountains, hard enough to shake the hanging signs outside the saloon and feed store. The stagecoach from Helena arrived just after 2:30, its wheels grinding through gray slush and frozen mud before stopping beside the depot platform. Most folks barely looked up anymore when coaches came through town. Red Flint sat too far north and too far cold for much excitement, but people looked that afternoon, because the last passenger stepping down from the coach was a woman traveling alone. Eleanor Bellamy paused at the bottom step with one gloved hand wrapped around the rail. Her dress had once been dark blue. The weeks of travel had faded it into something closer to smoke. Snow dusted the shoulders of her coat. A small brown suitcase rested beside her boots. She looked tired in the way long journeys make people tired. Not weak, just worn thin around the edges. At the far end of the platform stood Horace Givens, tall, nervous, hair slicked down too carefully beneath his hat. He held folded agency papers in one hand and kept glancing toward the saloon porch across the street, where 3 cattlemen leaned against the railing with whiskey glasses in their hands. One of them laughed first. "So that's your bride, Horace?" Another whistled low. Thought mail-order girls came younger. Horace's face tightened. He looked at Nora, then back toward the men. The wind carried the smell of coal smoke and horse sweat across the platform. Nora stepped closer, her voice quiet after so many days on the road. "Mr. Givens?" Horace cleared his throat but didn't answer right away. The men on the porch kept watching. One called out, "Better ask if she can cook before you marry her." A few chuckles followed. Horace gave a strained laugh that sounded wrong even to himself. Then he looked at Nora properly for the first time, almost like he regretted doing it. "Can you cook anything besides poorhouse stew?" he asked loudly. The laughter came quicker now. Nora felt every eye on the platform settle over her coat, her shoes, her old suitcase. Her fingers tightened around the handle until the leather creaked softly beneath her glove. But she didn't lower her eyes, didn't cry either. The coach driver looked away first. Horace unfolded the papers in his hand like they might somehow defend him from the embarrassment creeping up his neck. "Listen," he muttered. "This arrangement, maybe it was a mistake." The wind snapped hard between the buildings. Nora stared at him for a long moment, long enough to realize he had already made his decision before she ever stepped off that coach. "You could written," she said. Horace swallowed, but said nothing. That silence answered well enough. A minute later, he turned and walked off the platform with the papers still in his hand, while the men outside the saloon smirked into their drinks. Nobody stopped him. Nobody stopped her either. Soon the coach rolled away again, leaving Nora standing alone beside her suitcase while snow drifted across the empty tracks. Across the street, a tall man stepped out of Grady's Hardware, carrying a small sack of nails and horseshoe fittings beneath one arm. Rhett Mercer. Most people in Red Flint knew him by sight before they knew him by voice. He worked wild horses north of town and rarely stayed anywhere longer than necessary. Quiet man, broad shoulders, weather-beaten coat, the kind of face that looked carved from old timber. He stood still on the boardwalk, watching the platform, watching the woman who refused to fold in half even after being humiliated in front of half the town. Nora bent to lift her suitcase. The handle tore loose in her hand. Not completely, just enough for the leather to split. For the first time, something flickered across her face. Not tears, just exhaustion. Rhett crossed the street then. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he stopped a few feet from her. Up close, he smelled faintly of cedar, cold wind, and horse leather. His gaze dropped briefly toward the broken suitcase handle. Then back to her. "Can you cook?" he asked. Nora blinked once, not because of the question, because unlike the others, he didn't sound amused. "Well enough to make people stay at the table," she answered. Something shifted in Rhett's face then. Small enough most people would missed it. The wind rattled the depot windows behind them. Finally, he nodded once toward the north road. "I've got a ranch about an hour outside town," he said. "Need help around the house. Cooking mostly." Nora waited. "There's 2 kids there," he added after a moment. "And too much quiet." Snow gathered along the shoulders of his coat while Main Street watched from a distance, pretending not to. "It'd be temporary," Rhett said. "Until you figure out what comes next." Nora looked down the long white road disappearing north beyond the town. Then back toward the saloon where Horace Givens had vanished. Nothing waited for her there anymore. A loose shutter banged somewhere in the wind. Rhett reached down and lifted her suitcase before she could answer. The broken handle dangled against his wrist. "Road gets worse after dark," he said. For a second, Nora stayed where she was. Then she followed him. People watched them cross Main Street together through drifting snow. Edith Crowley stood outside the bank in a fur-lined coat, eyes narrow with interest. 2 ranch hands stopped talking entirely as Rhett helped Nora climb into the wagon beside him. Neither of them spoke as he snapped the reins. The horses started forward slowly through the frozen street. Behind them, Red Flint kept watching until wagon wheels disappeared into the white northern road leading toward the Mercer Ranch beneath the Bitterroot sky. And somewhere under the sound of the wind and harness chains, Nora realized something strange. The cowboy beside her had never once looked at her like a mistake. The road north of Red Flint narrowed after the last row of buildings disappeared behind them. Snow covered the fields in long, uneven stretches, broken only by fence posts and dark pine trees bending beneath the wind. Rhett Mercer drove without much talking. The lantern hanging beside the wagon seat rocked softly with every rut in the frozen road. Once in a while, he reached down to steady Nora's suitcase with one hand whenever the wheels hit rough ground. By the time they crossed Mercer Creek, daylight had nearly gone blue. "There," Rhett said quietly. Nora looked up. The ranch sat low beneath a rise of dark hills, a barn, a long horse pen, smoke drifting from a chimney into the cold evening sky. One lantern burned near the stable door, throwing gold light over packed snow and wagon tracks. It did not look unhappy, just tired. Rhett climbed down first and tied the horses near the porch rail. The front gate creaked sharply in the wind when he pushed it closed behind them. Inside, the house smelled faintly of firewood, coffee grounds, and old cedar. Warm, but barely. Everything had a place. Boots lined beside the wall, tin cups hanging above the sink. A folded blanket laid perfectly across the back of the sofa. Nothing looked lived in. A little girl appeared first. She stood near the hallway, holding a rag doll with one missing button eye sewn crookedly back on. Thin braids, bare feet inside wool, socks too large for her ankles. Her eyes fixed entirely on Nora. "Daisy," Rhett said, setting down the suitcase. "This is Miss Bellamy." Daisy nodded once without speaking. Then a boy stepped into the room behind her, taller, narrow-faced, dark hair falling into his eyes. Caleb Mercer. He looked at Nora, the way stray dogs sometimes looked at strangers holding food. Interested, careful, expecting disappointment anyway. "She staying?" he asked. "For now," Rhett answered. Caleb gave a small shrug that pretended not to matter and disappeared toward the kitchen again. Daisy stayed exactly where she was. Nora removed her gloves slowly. warming stiff fingers near the stove. "I can make supper," she offered. Rhett glanced toward the kitchen clock. "Nearly 7. "There's beans in the pantry," he said. "Cornmeal, too." Nora nodded once and rolled her sleeves carefully above her wrists. The kitchen told her things almost immediately. A cracked white cup sat untouched on the upper shelf. Dust gathered around it while every other dish had been used recently. One kitchen towel hung folded too neatly beside the stove, like nobody had touched it in years. And near the sink sat a jar of sourdough starter, gone half dead from neglect. Nora rested her fingers lightly against the jar. "You bake?" Daisy asked quietly from the doorway. "I used to," Nora answered. The child stepped closer after that, not much, just enough. An hour later, the smell of frying onions and fresh cornbread drifted through the house for the first time in a very long while. Rhett returned from the barn carrying split wood against one shoulder. He stopped near the kitchen doorway, without announcing himself. Nora stood at the stove, brushing butter over hot bread with the side of a spoon. For a moment, nobody spoke. The warm smell filling the room did enough talking already. At supper, Caleb kept his eyes mostly on his plate. Daisy watched Nora openly while eating stew, so quickly she burned her tongue. "Slow down," Rhett muttered. "She cooks better than Mrs. Porter," Daisy whispered. Caleb kicked her lightly beneath the table. Rhett looked down at his coffee cup to hide something that almost became a smile. Later that night, Nora woke to cold air slipping under her bedroom door. She stepped into the hallway carrying her boots and found the kitchen dark except for faint firelight. Rhett stood barefoot beside the stove, eating a piece of cornbread straight from the pan with one hand. He looked up immediately, caught. For one awkward second, he almost resembled a boy stealing pie cooling on a windowsill. "Sorry," he said. Nora leaned lightly against the doorway. "You own the house." Still feels rude somehow. That pulled the smallest breath of laughter from her before she could stop it. Rhett stared at her then. Not long, just enough to notice the sound. The next morning, snow covered the porch steps nearly to the railing. Nora found Daisy asleep beside the stove, wrapped in a blanket she'd dragged from the sofa sometime before dawn. Caleb came in carrying firewood, stopped short, and frowned. "You're supposed to stack that inside," Nora told him gently. "I know. Then, why's it buried outside?" He looked directly at her, testing, waiting. Nora simply held out her hand toward the woodpile. After a moment, Caleb sighed, turned around, and carried the logs back out into the snow. Rhett watched the entire thing quietly from the doorway, while pulling on his gloves. Before leaving for the horse pens, he paused beside the kitchen entrance. "The back door sticks when it freezes," he said. Nora glanced over. "I noticed. That evening the door closed cleanly without sticking once. She never saw him fix it." 3 nights later, the storm rolled in hard from the mountains. Wind hammered the barn walls after dark. One of the horses broke part of the side latch during the noise. Rhett grabbed his coat immediately. "I'll help," Nora said before he could object. Snow hit them sideways, crossing the yard. Inside the barn, the horses stamped nervously while lantern light shook across the stalls. Rhett fought the loose gate with numb hands until finally the chain caught again. By then the storm had turned too thick to cross safely back to the house. "We waited out," he said. Nora nodded once. They sat on overturned feed crates near the lantern while snow battered the roof overhead. Rhett spread an old wool blanket across both of them without comment. The warmth settled slowly. So did the silence. Horses breathed heavily nearby. Wind pushed cold air through the cracks in the barn walls. Once, the lantern flickered low enough that Rhett reached across Nora carefully to shield the flame with his hand. Neither of them moved away after. Near midnight, the storm weakened enough to return home. They crossed the yard shoulder to shoulder through knee-high snow. Inside the house, Daisy lay curled asleep on the sofa beneath 2 blankets. One small lantern still burned near the window. Her eyes opened halfway when the door shut behind them. "You came back together?" she murmured sleepily. Rhett stopped removing his gloves. For a long moment, he simply stood there looking at the child. Then at Nora beside him, with snow melting softly from her coat onto the kitchen floor. "Yes," he said quietly, and something about the way he answered made the whole room feel warmer than the fire ever had. The storm passed during the night. Morning came pale and still over the Mercer ranch. Snow rested deep along the fence rails and pine branches, while thin smoke drifted from the chimney into a sky the color of worn tin. Nora woke before the others. She tied her hair back with a faded ribbon and moved carefully through the kitchen in wool stockings, so the floorboards would not creak too loudly. Coffee grounds rattled softly into the pot. Biscuit dough rested beneath her hands while the stove ticked with steady heat. Outside, she could hear Rhett splitting wood. Slow rhythm, measured, like a man thinking about something he had not yet found words for. Daisy wandered into the kitchen wrapped entirely in a blanket except for her face. "You make biscuits every morning?" she asked sleepily. "No," Nora said. "Only mornings that feel cold enough to deserve them." Daisy nodded like that made perfect sense. Caleb came in later carrying Snow on his boots and a saddle strap over one shoulder. He stopped at the table when Nora slid a plate toward him. "You don't gotta wait on me," he muttered. "I know." He looked at her for a second, almost suspicious of the answer, then sat anyway. The days settled after that, not suddenly, quietly, like snow filling old tracks in the road. Nora began reading to Daisy at night beside the fire, while Rhett repaired tack near the window. Caleb pretended not to listen from the table while sharpening pocket knives or carving at bits of scrap wood. But every now and then Nora would pause during a story, and Caleb would glance up before she turned the next page. One evening, Rhett returned late from hauling feed near Miller's Crossing. His coat carried the smell of horses and cold air. Nora had left stew warming near the stove beneath a folded towel to keep the heat in. He stood there looking at it longer than necessary. "You didn't have to wait up," he said. Nora shrugged lightly while drying dishes. "The potatoes would have gone soft if I didn't." Rhett nodded once. But later she noticed he ate every last spoonful from the pot. The following Sunday they rode into Red Flint for church. Nora almost stayed behind. She knew how towns worked. People remembered humiliation longer than kindness. But Daisy had taken her hand before breakfast and asked if she would braid her hair for town. So Nora went. The church smelled of wet wool coats and melting snow. Boots scraped old wooden floors while people settled into pews beneath lantern light. Conversations lowered when Nora entered beside the Mercer family. Not stopped, just lowered enough to notice. Edith Crowley stood near the back wearing dark green velvet, trimmed with fur around the collar. Her smile arrived before her words did. "Well," Edith said softly, "seems the Mercer ranch found itself a lady after all." Nora returned the smile politely. "For now," Edith added. The words floated there, pleasantly enough for strangers not to question them. But the meaning underneath landed clean. Rhett heard it. Nora knew he did because his jaw shifted once before he removed his gloves. Still, he said nothing. And somehow that restraint carried more weight than anger would have. After church, Daisy begged for peppermint sticks from the general store while Caleb disappeared toward the stable yard to stare at horses he had no money to buy. Nora waited outside beneath the awning while snow began drifting down again. Edith Crowley stepped beside her, holding a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "A woman living alone with a widower," Edith said lightly. "Folks will make stories out of that eventually." Nora looked out toward Main Street. "They already have." Edith tilted her head, surprised by the calmness of it. "You seem very settled for someone temporary." Nora folded her gloves slowly before answering. "I've learned not to mistake kindness for promises, Mrs. Crowley." For the first time, Edith had nothing ready to say. That night, the house felt quieter than usual. Not empty, Careful. Rhett sat near the stove, oiling a saddle strap while Snow tapped softly against the windows. Nora stitched a tear in Daisy's winter coat beneath the lamp. Caleb looked between them once or twice from the kitchen table, watching something take shape he did not yet trust. Then winter deepened. One gray morning, Daisy came running barefoot through the hallway, chasing the smell of cinnamon bread cooling near the stove. Her sock caught the edge of the rug. She hit the floor hard enough to startle herself. For one tiny second, the house held still. Then came tears. Nora dropped to her knees beside her immediately. "You're all right," she whispered gently, gathering the little girl close. "Easy now. Let me see." Daisy buried her face against Nora's shoulder, crying harder from fright than pain. And without thinking, without planning it, she said the word that had already become true somewhere inside her. "Mama." The kitchen went silent, completely silent. Nora's hand froze against Daisy's back. In the hallway, Rhett stood motionless beside the coat rack, one glove still half pulled onto his hand. Caleb looked up from the table. No one moved. The fire cracked softly inside the stove. Daisy pulled back first, suddenly aware enough to realize what she had said. Her small face turned red. "I didn't mean—" "It's all right," Nora whispered quickly. But her own voice sounded thinner now. Rhett lowered his eyes briefly toward the floorboards, not hiding disappointment. Something far more dangerous than that. Hope. Breakfast passed quietly afterward. Caleb stared into his coffee more than he drank it. Daisy stayed unusually close beside Nora while helping wash plates. Rhett left for the barn early without finishing his eggs. That evening, Nora stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing flour from her hands when she noticed movement through the window. Rhett sat alone outside on the porch rail beneath falling snow, hat low over his brow, elbows resting on his knees. The lantern beside him had nearly burned out. Still, he remained there, watching the kitchen light through the frosted glass, while inside the house behind Nora slowly forgot what loneliness used to sound like. January settled hard over Montana territory after that. The roads iced over each morning before sunrise. Wagon wheels left deep frozen grooves along the trail into red flint, and smoke from the ranch chimneys hung low beneath the clouds instead of rising clean. At the Mercer Ranch, small things kept changing. Rhett began hunching the horses faster at night, like a man in a hurry to get home without admitting it aloud. Caleb stopped eating supper with one elbow guarding his plate, like someone preparing for departure. Daisy no longer asked Nora if she would still be there in the morning. The asking had stopped. That mattered more. One evening, Nora stood at the kitchen counter kneading bread dough while Caleb repaired a bridle strap beside the stove. Rhett came in carrying a crate of horseshoes from town. "There's a shipment coming through Livingston next month," he said, setting the crate down. "Might finally replace the north fence before spring." Caleb grunted. Then after a pause, he looked toward Nora without lifting his head. "You ever ridden before?" Nora brushed flour from her wrists. "Not well enough to brag about." "That means no." A corner of Rhett's mouth moved slightly before he bent to remove snow from his boots. It was the first joke Caleb had made around her. Nobody mentioned it. That Sunday, Nora rode into town alone for flour, lamp oil, and coffee beans. Rhett had work breaking a nervous gelding, and Daisy needed new soles stitched onto her winter shoes before church. The streets of Red Flint were crowded despite the cold. Men carried feed sacks between wagons while steam drifted from the bakery windows onto Main Street. Nora stepped out of the general store, holding a wrapped parcel against her coat, when she heard Edith Crowley's voice nearby. "She's settling in nicely for somebody temporary." The words floated softly beneath the striped awning of the dry goods store. Edith stood with two other women dressed in fur collars and polished boots too fine for ranch mud. One pretended to study gloves in the display window while listening carefully. Nora kept walking. Edith smiled after her. "Children grow attached quickly," she he added. That's the dangerous part. Nora stopped then. Not long, just enough. She turned back slowly, snow crunching beneath her boots. Children usually know who feels safe, she said. Edith's smile thinned. Nora walked away before the woman could answer, but the exchange followed her all the way back to the wagon yard. That night she stood longer than usual beside the kitchen window, while snow drifted across the pasture fences outside. Rhett noticed. You all right? Nora dried a clean plate carefully before setting it away. I'm fine. He leaned one shoulder against the doorway. That usually means you're not. The room quieted. Fire snapped softly inside the stove. Finally, Nora folded the dish towel once between her hands. Folks in town are starting to talk. Rhett looked unsurprised. They've been talking since the day I brought you home. That doesn't bother you? No. His answer came too fast to doubt. Nora looked down at the sink a while before speaking again. It should. Rhett studied her face in the yellow stove light. Then he crossed the kitchen, took the empty coffee cup from beside her elbow, and refilled it without asking. The gesture was so ordinary it nearly hurt. You've made this house lighter, he said quietly. People usually resent things they don't have themselves. Nora stared at the steam curling from the fresh coffee. Neither of them said anything afterward. But later that night she lay awake longer than usual, listening to the sound of his boots crossing the porch outside before bed. 3 days later, Horace Givens rode back into Red Flint. The first person to see him was Dale Barker outside the feed store. By supper, half the town knew the man who'd abandoned the mail-order bride had returned wearing a new coat and carrying legal papers folded inside his saddlebag. By morning, Edith Crowley knew too. And by noon, so did Rhett Mercer. He heard it while loading grain sacks near the stable yard behind Grady's Hardware. 2 ranch hands talking low near the alley. Fella says she came west under contract. Too late now. Depends who's holding the papers. Rhett tied the grain sack tighter than necessary. Nothing in his face changed, but he worked through dinner without coming inside the house once. The next morning, Nora rode into town for baking yeast and thread. Cold wind swept straight down Main Street, hard enough to whip snow against the hitching posts. She had just stepped off the boardwalk outside the general store when a voice behind her said her name, Horace Givens. She froze. He looked cleaner than before. Better coat, better boots, but his eyes still shifted nervously whenever people looked too long at him. I've been trying to find you, he said. Nora said nothing. Horace pulled folded papers from inside his coat. You came west under agreement, he muttered. Folks know that. A few people slowed nearby. Edith Crowley appeared beneath the dry goods awning almost immediately, pretending interest in a fabric display while watching everything. She came west for me, Horace announced louder. The street began to quiet. Nora felt the same cold humiliation creeping toward her from weeks earlier at the depot platform. Only this time she did not stand alone. Hoofbeats approached from the north road. Rhett Mercer swung down from his horse before it fully stopped moving. Snow blew across the street between them. Horace lifted the papers higher. I got rights here. Rhett looked once at the documents, then at Nora. Her hands remained still at her sides, but her knuckles had already gone white beneath her gloves. Without a word, Rhett turned and walked straight toward the bank. People watched through the windows as he disappeared inside. 4 long minutes passed. Then he returned carrying a folded stack of bills held tight in one hand. The entire street had gone silent by then, except for the creak of harness leather and the distant sound of a hammer striking somewhere behind the blacksmith shop. Rhett stopped directly in front of Horace. That pays for every mile she traveled, he said flatly. He shoved the money into Horace's chest hard enough the man nearly stumbled. Not 1 inch of her belongs to you. Nobody moved. Even Edith Crowley looked stunned into silence. Horace stared down at the money in his shaking hands. Shame crawled slowly up his neck, while half the town watched him stand there, bought out by a man who never raised his voice once. Finally, he backed away, then turned and disappeared down the street without another word. The wind carried snow through the empty space he left behind. Rhett faced Nora then, not the crowd, only her. "You can leave if you want," he said quietly. "But the house—" He stopped there briefly, almost searching for the right words. "Don't feel right without you anymore." Nora looked at him standing in the middle of Main Street with snow gathering across the shoulders of his coat, and realized something she had spent years trying not to need. Some people became home slowly, and some arrived all at once. The ride back from Red Flint passed mostly in silence. Snow fell lightly through the pine trees lining the north road, while the wagon wheels cut fresh tracks through powder, already turning blue beneath evening shadows. Rhett kept one hand steady on the reins, and the other resting loosely near his knee. Nora sat beside him, wrapped in her wool coat, watching the dark outline of the Mercer Ranch slowly appear through the drifting snow. Neither of them mentioned the money. Neither mentioned Horace. But the space between them had changed, not smaller, certain. When they reached the house, Daisy burst through the front door before the wagon fully stopped. "You came back," she shouted, boots half unlaced and coat hanging crooked from one shoulder. Caleb followed slower onto the porch, trying not to look relieved. Nora smiled despite herself. That hurt a little now, because Edith Crowley's words had followed her home harder than the winter wind. Children grow attached quickly. That night after supper, Nora stayed awake long after the others had gone upstairs. The kitchen lamp burned low while she folded dresses carefully into her old suitcase beside the table. The broken leather handle Rhett had carried from the depot still hung loose on one side. Outside, the ranch stood quiet beneath fresh snow. She paused once while wrapping her mother's hairbrush in a cloth napkin. It was the only thing she owned that had belonged to family. The house creaked softly around her. From upstairs came Daisy's sleepy cough. Nora closed her eyes briefly, then continued packing. Near dawn, Caleb appeared in the doorway barefoot and half awake, holding his blanket around his shoulders. At first, he only stared at the suitcase. Then his face changed. "No." Nora looked up quickly. "Caleb, you're leaving." It wasn't a question. The boy stepped farther into the kitchen, anger arriving too fast for him to hide it. "Everybody leaves," he snapped. "You said you wouldn't." Nora stood slowly beside the table. "I never said that. You stayed." His voice cracked hard on the last word. From the hallway, Daisy appeared, rubbing sleep from her eyes. The moment she saw the suitcase, her small face folded completely. "No," she whispered. Nora knelt immediately as Daisy threw both arms around her neck. "I don't want another new person," Daisy cried against her shoulder. The kitchen blurred for a second. Nora held the little girl tighter. Behind them, Caleb turned away quickly toward the stove, pretending to fix the firewood stack, though his hands shook badly enough that one log rolled across the floorboards. The front door opened then. Cold air swept inside. Rhett Mercer stepped into the house, carrying snow across his coat and shoulders after returning early from a horse delivery near Elk Ridge. He stopped the moment he saw the suitcase. Nobody spoke. The grandfather clock near the hallway ticked softly into the silence. Rhett removed his gloves one finger at a time without taking his eyes off the table. Finally, he crossed the room. Not fast, not slow either, just steady. Nora stood carefully as Daisy clung to the side of her skirt. Rhett reached into his coat pocket and placed something small onto the kitchen table between them. An old ring. Simple gold worn smooth around the edges from years of use. "My mother's," he said quietly. Nora looked at the ring but did not touch it. Rhett rested one hand against the back of a chair. "You can leave if you want," he said. The words landed gently. No anger, no pressure, only truth. "But stay because you want to," he continued. "Not because you got nowhere else." The stove cracked softly behind them. Daisy's fingers tightened in Nora's skirt. Caleb stood frozen beside the fire, pretending not to listen, while his eyes stayed red from lack of sleep and something else he would never admit out loud. Nora looked around the kitchen slowly, at the half-finished loaf cooling near the window, at Caleb's gloves drying beside the stove, at Daisy's rag doll lying forgotten near the stairs, at the coffee cup Rhett always left beside the sink every morning before work. Small things, ordinary things, the kind people only noticed once they belonged somewhere. Outside, dawn light spread pale gold across the snow-covered pasture fences. Nora lowered her eyes toward the suitcase one last time, then quietly pushed it away from the door with her foot. Daisy made a small sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob at the same time. Rhett let out a breath, so slowly it felt like he'd been holding it since the day he first saw her standing alone on that depot platform. Later that evening, they sat together near the stove while wind moved softly through the pines outside. The children had fallen asleep early from excitement and tears. Rhett sat across from Nora at the kitchen table, turning his coffee cup once between his hands. "There's something I never told you," he said. Nora looked up. "That first day in town, I didn't bring you home because I felt sorry for you." The lantern light flickered gently across his face. "You were standing there alone with half the town watching you fall apart," he said. "And you didn't." Nora stayed still. Rhett looked down briefly before meeting her eyes again. "You were the only person standing there who looked stronger than the town." Silence settled between them after that. Not empty silence, the kind that finally gets to rest. Winter loosened slowly after February. Snow melted from the pasture hills in silver streams. Mud returned to the roads. Horses kicked through thawing ground outside the barn, while sunlight stayed longer each evening. By spring, the Mercer Ranch no longer felt like a place waiting for ghosts to return. Daisy ran laughing through fields spotted with wildflowers beyond the creek. Caleb taught Nora how to guide a young mare through narrow fence turns without spooking her. Rhett built a larger kitchen window, facing east, so morning light poured directly across the table during breakfast. And some evenings, when supper stretched longer than necessary, Nora would look around at the 4 plates scattered across the worn wooden table while coffee steamed beside fresh bread, and laughter drifted through the open window. Nobody hurried away anymore. Nobody ate alone. And somewhere beyond the pasture fences, beneath the wide Montana sky, the lonely little ranch that had once forgotten how to live finally remembered. Maybe that's why stories like this stay with people. Not because of grand speeches or perfect endings, but because somewhere deep down, most folks know what it feels like to stand where Nora once stood. Cold, tired, carrying everything they own in one hand while trying not to let the world see what's breaking inside them. And maybe some of us know what it feels like to become Rhett, too. To build walls so quietly and for so long that we forget a home is supposed to sound alive. In the end, it wasn't money that saved that ranch. It wasn't pride. It wasn't even time. It was small things. A warm kitchen, a lantern left burning, someone waiting at the table, a little girl saying "Mama" before she even realized it herself. Sometimes love doesn't arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes in slow, careful steps across a snowy porch and stays long enough to heal rooms that have been empty for years. If this story stayed with you tonight, tell me where you were listening from, or which moment felt closest to your own life. And if you'd like, there are more quiet roads ahead, more forgotten towns, more lonely hearts finding their way back home beneath the western sky. I'll be here when the next story begins.